The stagecoach slammed down and dust rose like burnt gold. Late sun leaned low and the station boards creaked softly. Coldwater Pass sat quiet, yet every eye still watched arrivals. I was there waiting, and my name was Boone Hart. Folks called me Mountain Man, though I never asked them. I stood by the rail and kept my hands visible. A man learns manners when strangers fear what he carries. My coat was plain and my beard needed trimming. I wore no town smile and I didn't try selling. I just watched the coach and listened to horses breathe. The driver jumped down and spat grit beside his boot. He tipped his hat and squinted into the dying light. He said my bride came, and his tone turned careful. I nodded once and felt my throat go dry anyway. 5 months of letters and 1 photograph lived in pocket. The paper smelled of lamp oil and hope I didn't name. I wasn't courting a dream, I was buying a chance. Up here, winters bite deep and loneliness bites deeper. A cabin needs 2 sets of hands that don't quit. My notice was honest and it promised no fancy living. I offered shelter and steak and asked for partnership. That kind of deal sounds cold, but it keeps souls. Love can grow later if respect gets planted first. The coach door opened, and the crowd leaned forward together. A gloved hand showed, and it shook like a leaf. A blue dress stepped down, and the hem was dusted. Then she appeared fully, and the whole platform went still. She wasn't smiling at all, and tears ran unhidden. Her bonnet sat crooked, and her breath came in snaps. I saw a bruise rising near her left cheekbone. Not fresh blood, just color like old anger settling. Some women cry from fear, and some cry from relief. This one cried like both and couldn't stop herself. A few men stared hard and didn't bother hiding it. One laughed under breath, and his friends nudged each other. I hated that sound, and my jaw set tight. I stepped forward slowly and kept my boots gentle. She clutched a small valise like it could save her. Her eyes found mine, and they didn't ask for romance. They asked for safety, and for one honest moment, I took off my hat and held it at my side. She tried to speak once and swallowed the words instead. The driver cleared his throat and muttered that she'd been silent. He said she cried some and refused food the whole way. I thanked him quietly, and my voice sounded older. Then I saw the crowd shift and make a narrow lane. A man in a long coat stood near the freight scales. He wore a bright badge, and it caught the sunlight. Folks stepped back from him like he carried sickness. He didn't look at me, he watched the crying girl. His mouth made a little curl like he'd already won. I didn't like that face, and I'd met worse faces. The girl saw him too, and her shoulders folded inward. Her tears changed then and turned from shame to panic. She took 1 step back and nearly fell off the plank. I reached out steady and caught her elbow lightly. She flinched at the touch, and that told me plenty. I pulled my hand away and showed her I could wait. The badge man started walking, and boots clicked on boards. The crowd opened wider, and nobody asked him a thing. He carried himself proud, like law made him king here. I looked at his eyes, and they were hungry eyes. A real marshal watches calmly. This man watched like a wolf. I didn't draw steel, and I didn't need to. I reached into my pocket and found a clean cloth. It was my spare bandage, folded for cold mornings. I held it out open and kept my voice low. I said, "Take this and wipe your face if you want." Her hands trembled hard, and she couldn't hold the cloth. So I lifted it gently and dabbed tears from her cheek. I stayed careful near the bruise, and she noticed that. The badge man paused close, and I smelled cheap tobacco. He spoke her name softly, and it wasn't the name. She shook her head fast, and her lips went white. I turned my shoulder slightly and blocked his view of her. I said, "She's with me," and my tone stayed flat. He smiled wider then, and he tapped his badge once. He said, "Law's with me, and you don't want trouble." I stared at the badge and saw it sat wrong. It hung too low there, and the pin looked new. I'd carried papers before, and I knew that careless shine. The girl whispered 2 words, and they cut through everything. She said he followed, and my stomach tightened hard. I leaned closer and spoke where only she could hear. I said, "You don't have to pretend with me." Her eyes widened sharp, and fresh tears filled up again. Not pretty tears now, just fear spilling over the rim. I nodded once slow, and I chose my next breath. I said, "You're safe here if you'll walk with me." The badge man stepped nearer, and his hand drifted lower. Not on a gun yet, just down like a warning. I stepped between them and kept my palms open still. I said, "We're leaving, and you can speak to me later." He said, "You'll answer me," and his voice stayed oily. I said, "Talk to the driver," and he blinked, surprised. Drivers know distances and they know who paid the fare. He glanced around quick and saw no help coming. The crowd watched like stones and nobody moved at all. That's how towns turn bad when fear becomes their habit. I took the girl's valise and set it beside my boot. I pointed at my mule team in the small freight wagon. I told her, "Step up and keep your head down." She obeyed like practice, and that broke my heart some. The badge man followed close, and his shadow touched the wheel. I looked straight at him and I spoke real plain. I said, "Your badge looks new, and your manners look mean." His smile slipped a notch and his eyes sharpened cold. He said, "You're a hermit and you don't know the law." I said, "I know men, and that's enough for now." The girl gripped the seat rail, and her knuckles turned pale. I climbed up beside her and took the reins steady. I didn't rush the team yet, I didn't linger. Wheels creaked forward, slow, and dust rose behind us again. The badge man stood watching, and he didn't shout yet, but his stare promised later, and I believed that promise. The girl breathed one line, and it came out broken. She said, "He'll take me if you leave me here." I kept my eyes ahead and spoke like winter coming. I said, "Nobody takes you while I can still stand." The town fell behind us, and the mountains waited quiet. Wind cut across sage, and the sky turned iron blue. I felt her shaking ease, yet fear still rode close. That first mile told me truth, and trouble had a name. I didn't know her story, but I knew that look. And I knew one thing sure, this wasn't just romance. Folks in Coldwater Pass figured I was born rough because I lived above timberline and came down only when hides and salt ran low again. They didn't see the mornings when I brewed weak coffee and read old letters by firelight, trying to remember how a man stays human alone. My cabin sat in a notch of spruce with a spring that never froze solid and a view that could break a proud heart quietly. I kept traps on the creek bends and I kept my rifle clean, but my best tool was patience, earned the hard way long ago. I'd been a river guide for miners and a mule skinner for freighters, and I learned the mountains don't care who you were yesterday either. Still, men do care, and they talk in stores and saloons, so I stayed out and let the gossip starve on itself all winter long. The last time I tried courting local, I watched a good woman flinch at my silence, and I knew I wasn't ready for vows then. She wanted stories, and I had only burned images, so I let her go kindly, and I took my shame back uphill at dusk alone. It wasn't the war that made me wary, it was what came after, when neighbors chose rumors over truth and sleep over guilt each time. A drifter got blamed for a robbery and the town strung him up fast, and later they found the real thief smiling in daylight openly. I still hear the rope creak sometimes when wind hits the porch posts, and I still see that man's boots twisting in my mind nightly. That's why I don't trust crowds, and I don't trust badges that shine too bright, because justice should look work-worn, not fresh from town. Up on my land I kept a small herd and a tight garden patch, and enough cured meat to outlast storms most years alone too. I could manage it all, but every task cost more now because my hands got older and my back argued at dawn some mornings hard. Some nights I'd sit with a book and talk to nobody and realize I was saving money yet losing time for no good reason all. That kind of quiet feels holy at first, then it turns mean and you start hearing your own thoughts like enemies in the dark nightly. So I wrote my notice careful and I paid the postman and I asked for a woman who could choose her own life out here. I didn't ask for beauty, I asked for grit and honesty and a willingness to learn, because that's what keeps fires lit through deep snow. In those letters I told her the truth about cold mornings, about wolves near the corral, and about my temper kept leashed by hard habit. I said I'd share the deed and share decisions and never treat a wife like hired help, because I'd seen that cruelty break women down. The replies came neat and polite with words that sounded educated yet not spoiled, and I respected that tone more than perfume or lace ever. She wrote about teaching children and about wanting space to breathe, and I pictured a steady woman, not a fluttering bird in a gilt cage. I kept her photograph folded, and I tried not to stare because I didn't want to invent a dream around ink and paper alone ever. But a man does imagine, and mine was simple, a warm lamp in winter and a voice answering back when I spoke too softly once. When the coach arrived today, I expected nerves, maybe shyness, maybe second thoughts, but I didn't expect fear on her skin like winter frost already. That bruise told me someone had handled her roughly, and the shaking told me it wasn't an accident or a stumble on honest ground ever. I'd seen women come west chasing land, and I'd seen women come west chasing men, but this one chased escape with tears she couldn't hide. Her eyes kept flicking toward that badge, and I knew the station was no longer neutral ground. It was a trap set for her alone. I've hauled strangers out of snow and I've buried strangers in spring, so I know the look of surrender before it turns to death itself. I also know pride and how it makes folks lie, so when I told her not to pretend, I meant it down to my bones. Some men want a crying woman because tears make her smaller, but I've never wanted small. I wanted true and steady beside me, always here. If she'd arrived smiling hard and hiding that bruise, she'd have played a part until the mountains punished her for every secret she carried alone. That's the bargain nobody tells you out here. Secrets weigh more than trunks, and lies freeze faster than water when nights drop below zero quick. So when I saw that false authority drifting close, I decided my first duty was not romance, it was shelter for a scared woman today. I didn't know yet if she'd tricked me or if she'd been tricked herself, but fear deserves a pause before you pass judgment too fast. My place in the mountains is plain, but it's mine, and nobody walks in there waving a shiny lie without meeting a hard answer first. That badge man thought he could speak, and the town would bow because he counted on people choosing easy stories over difficult truths every time. I've lived too long to accept easy, and I've seen too much to hand a woman back to wolves with paperwork and call it lawful. If I sounded calm, it wasn't bravery, it was practice, because panic wastes breath, and breath is currency in cold air up this high always. I told her she could speak later, and I meant later meant safe, where walls and trees block hungry eyes from men who like power. On the ride out, I felt the whole town watching, and I felt that badge burning holes in my back with every slow turn home. I'd asked for a partner, and instead I'd been handed trouble, yet trouble tells the truth faster than comfort does in a quiet house ever. By the time the mountains rose ahead, I'd already decided one thing: I'd hear her out before I blamed her for any man's wicked plan. Because I didn't send for a bride to own her, I sent for a chance to build, and I wouldn't build on fear smiles alone. Folks in Coldwater Pass kept staring behind us like shame was contagious. I didn't look back long, because looking back feeds a chaser's pride. We rolled out slow, and her sobs finally weakened into ragged breaths. She held her bonnet low, like daylight itself could accuse her still. I drove steady and let the horses choose a patient pace uphill. Her valise sat between us, and it looked too light for her. Most women carry life inside leather, but hers held almost nothing now. I asked her name gentle, and she answered after a long swallow. She said Clara Wynne, yet the sound didn't fit her face well. I'd read Amelia in letters, and I'd practiced saying it quietly alone. She watched my mouth like she feared the wrong word would burn. I didn't push, because pressure makes truth curl up and die fast. The road bent north, and pine shadows laid stripes across her dress. She touched the bruise once, and her fingers shook after contact there. I offered water, and she drank like she'd forgotten to breathe since. When she lowered the cup, tears returned without asking permission from her. She whispered that she wasn't the woman I'd been writing to before. I kept my eyes on the trail and waited for the rest. She said the letters were real, but the sender couldn't come west. I asked if the sender was dead, and she flinched hard then. She said not dead yet, not free, and that was worse somehow. Her hands twisted cloth, and the knuckles shone white in sun too. I told her she could stop, and we'd turn back if needed. She shook her head and said back meant him in chains again. That answer carried weight, and I felt it settle in silence deep. I asked who he was, and she glanced at trees like ears. She called him Deputy Rourke, and her voice cracked on the name. I'd heard that name at posts, and never heard kindness with it. She said he wasn't deputy, just a thief wearing a badge today. I asked why he wanted her, and she stared at her lap. She said she'd seen something, and he couldn't let her talk ever. The wagon wheels hummed, and my palms tightened on leather reins quietly. She admitted she'd taken the wrong seat on the train east once. A man argued nearby, and she overheard plans spoken too loud there. Those plans named a rancher and named a girl shipped west soon. She followed the trail of talk, and it led to Rourke alone. Rourke saw her listening and decided her silence couldn't be trusted then. She ran to the post office and asked about mail order notices. She found my name and thought a mountain man might hide her. That wasn't romance, it was math, and I respected it right away. She confessed she'd used another woman's letters borrowed like a coat once. I asked if the other woman agreed, and she couldn't answer plainly. She said the other woman was trapped and time was running out. Her eyes lifted, and I saw shame mixed with raw survival too. I told her shame won't keep you warm, but truth might tonight. She nodded and said her real name was Eliza Marlowe right now. Then she whispered she'd lied again because Eliza wasn't safe either here. I let the silence stretch and listened for anything behind us moving. Wind covered the world, yet fear has its own kind of sound. She said her birth name would get her killed if spoken aloud. I asked if Rourke had papers, and she said he had men. Men with wagons, men with knives, men who smiled at crying girls. She said the bruise was a warning, not the worst he'd do. I felt heat rise, and I kept it caged behind my teeth. Anger makes mistakes, and mistakes in mountains become graves fast every time. I asked what she wanted from me besides hiding for a night. She said she wanted a new name and a place to work. She said she'd earn her keep and never ask for pity again. That last word hit me because pity is a sharp weapon too. I told her I wasn't buying a story, I was buying truth. She stared at me and her breathing finally slowed into rhythm again. Then she said Rourke claimed she'd stolen money and that was false. The truth was she'd taken papers proving his badge came from murder. She'd grabbed them in panic when he struck her and laughed afterward. Those papers were sewn in her dress and she feared searching hands. She said if Rourke found them, he'd bury her beyond river stones. I believed her because liars decorate, and she spoke plain pain only. Still, I needed to see proof because my cabin isn't a grave. She nodded once and reached inside her bodice with shaking care too. She pulled out a folded scrap and my stomach turned cold fast. It held names and dates and one line read, Marshall Carter dead. My grip tightened because I'd met Carter once, and he was real. She said Rourke wore Carter's badge now and claimed God backed him. I looked back at the trail and saw dust far behind rising. Somebody was coming and the mountain suddenly felt smaller than before today. Eliza pressed her palms together and asked if I'd send her away. I told her not yet because we were already past kindness's edge. What mattered now was timing and who reached my cabin first alive. She swallowed hard and said she'd follow my rules without argument today. I told her Rule 1, no lies when danger's close enough here. Rule 2, if I say run, you run and don't look back. Rule 3, you trust my quiet because loud men get people killed. She nodded through tears and I heard hoofbeats start to climb upward. That was when I knew her half-truth had finally ended here. I snapped the reins and the team leaned forward like they understood. Eliza tucked the paper deep and held her breath against sobs again. Behind us, the first rider shouted and the sound carried ugly joy. I didn't answer him because answering gives men power they crave most. Eliza asked if my cabin was far, and I said 4 miles. She whispered 4 miles can be forever, and I couldn't disagree now. The mountains swallowed daylight, and the air tasted like coming snow soon. I watched the ridge ahead and chose a cut through thick timber. A straight road helps pursuers, but crooked ground helps the hunted live. Eliza's shoulders lifted when she realized I was thinking like prey too. I told her we'd talk again later when walls held our whispers. She said thank you softly, and that sounded like a promise made. Then the hoofbeats split and another rider tried circling us wide left. My pulse stayed slow, but my mind moved fast, counting seconds hard. Eliza leaned close and asked if I'd ever killed a man before. I said I've done what I had to and hated it always. She went quiet then because she understood the kind of help offered. As Coldwater Pass disappeared, I heard Rourke's voice, and it was close. We cut into the timber, but the riders stayed with us, and the sound of hooves kept bouncing off the rocks behind all day long. Eliza gripped the seat rail, and I steered toward a narrow draw where a wagon could vanish from sight in minutes up there easy enough. Rourke's voice came again close, now calling her a thief, calling me a kidnapper, and promising the town would thank him later for doing right. I didn't answer because men like that live on answers, and I'd rather starve him than feed his courage in front of witnesses today, too. When we hit the ridge trail, the pursuers slowed, and I saw why a second wagon waited below with 3 locals and a lantern lit. That wasn't a chase anymore, it was a net, and Coldwater Pass sat at the center of it, smiling like a trap set for us. I turned the team hard and took a side cut, but Eliza's breath hitched because the badge man finally rode into view right beside us. His coat flapped wide, his hat brim was flat as a blade, and that bright badge swung on his chest like bait in clean sun. He raised his hand, and the other riders checked their speed because he wanted this to look lawful, not desperate to every pair of eyes. Rourke called out that he was a deputy marshal, and he said the girl was wanted for fraud, and I was aiding her escape too. Even from that distance, I heard the rehearsed rhythm, the way a liar makes his lies sound like scripture when he needs help real badly. One of the locals shouted back, asking if he needed a rope, and the words landed on Eliza like stones in a dry well deep. I kept the wagon moving, but slower now because running hard would confirm his story for anyone still thinking it might be true here today. Rourke rode closer and he smiled at me like we were old friends. Then he spoke soft enough for the others to hear every word. He said, "Boone Hart, you're out of your depth," and he flashed a folded paper claiming it was a warrant signed in Helena this week. I asked him which judge, and his eyes flicked once, because a real officer knows the name that gives him cover without having to think. He answered too fast, and he picked a name I'd heard buried, and that was enough to tell me the paper was theater for sale. Eliza leaned toward me and whispered that he'd stolen the real badge from Marshal Carter, and Carter's body never made it home at all either. Rourke heard her whisper anyway, or guessed it, and his smile turned thin, because he knew fear can be used like reins on any woman. He said I could hand her over and walk away with no questions. Then he nodded toward my wagon as if offering mercy to me. I told him mercy doesn't come from a man surrounded by friends with ropes, and the locals shifted, embarrassed at being named out so plain. Rourke's voice stayed smooth, but his hand dropped near his holster, and I saw the twitch that comes before impatience breaks its own mask open. He told the men behind him that I was dangerous, a loner with guns, and he let them imagine blood so they'd obey him fast. That's how false law works. It makes ordinary folks feel heroic while they do ugly work for a man who won't dirty himself at all. I could have reached for my rifle, but that would have given him the picture he wanted, and Eliza would have paid first with her life right there. So I asked the crowd a question, plain and steady, and I said, "Why does a deputy need 3 helpers and 1 lantern in daylight?" A few men blinked, and one woman near the freight shed frowned because she understood that law usually travels alone when it's truly lawful here. Rourke laughed and said paperwork is heavy. Then he snapped that I was wasting time, and the warrant demanded immediate action by order of Washington. That last word was a mistake, because no frontier warrant talks like that, and the woman by the shed looked down at her own feet. Eliza whispered that the woman was the station clerk's wife, and she'd seen Carter ride through last month alive and laughing before he vanished north. Rourke saw the doubt ripple, and his eyes hardened, so he changed tactics and promised the town a reward for cooperation paid in silver coins. Silver makes weak men brave, and it makes hungry men cruel, so the locals took a step nearer, measuring my wagon and her small hands. I told Eliza to keep her head down, and I told her to breathe because panic is loud, and loud gets hunted up here, so... Rourke leaned in close and spoke for my ears alone, and he said, "You can't protect her, not against a town that thinks it's right." I answered him just as quiet, and I said, "A town can be wrong, and I won't help it be wrong again for your profit." His breath smelled like whiskey, and his smile came back because he'd decided I was the obstacle, and obstacles get removed by any means necessary. He lifted his voice and declared he'd take her alive or take her name, and the crowd murmured like a storm building over dry grass. Eliza's fingers slipped into her dress seam, and I knew she was checking that paper like a lifeline tied to her ribs in secret fear. I said we'd go to the preacher or the clerk or any man who could read, and we'd test that warrant in daylight right now. Rourke refused, and that refusal cracked his mask because lawful men don't fear questions, and he feared everyone I set before him today plainly. He signaled the locals, and they moved like a pack, but the woman by the shed shouted that Carter's badge had a nick on the... Rourke froze one heartbeat, and in that pause I saw my opening, because a lie always pauses when truth speaks up from an unexpected mouth. I snapped the reins and turned downhill toward the creek crossing, forcing the pack to choose chase hard or keep pretending they were just helping. Eliza let out one sharp sob, then she went silent, because silence is what survivors learn when wolves circle close on all sides at once. Behind us, Rourke shouted that I'd attacked an officer, and he promised anyone who stopped me would be paid in silver before night fell fully. That was the moment the chase became a hunt, and I felt the old rope memory rise, telling me what towns do when they feel. I leaned toward Eliza, and I said, "Keep that paper safe, because it's the only knife we've got that cuts his power clean in public." She nodded once and whispered she'd rather die than go back, and I told her we weren't dying today, not yet, not for his lies. I cut the team into the spruce, and the world went quiet. Snow scent rode the wind, and daylight thinned behind gray cloud banks. Eliza sat rigid, holding her breath, while my horses climbed steady uphill. I chose a side trail because straight roads favor men with warrants. The cabin smoke would be hidden if we reached it before dusk. Rourke's riders stayed back, but their whistles carried through timber today still. Eliza touched the seam at her ribs, checking that folded proof again. I told her fear's loud, but calm can fool a hunting pack. She asked if winter always comes this fast, and I nodded once. The first flakes fell, and they melted on Eliza's lashes quickly there. My cabin appeared at last, tucked low under rock and pine shelves. I swung the wagon behind a windbreak and killed the lantern light. Inside, the air smelled of cedar, iron, and old coffee grounds here. Eliza stood by the door like she expected judgment to enter first. I set my rifle high so she'd see restraint, not threat tonight. She watched my hands and her shoulders lowered a little at last. I poured warm water and cleaned the dried tears from her cheeks. When cloth brushed the bruise, she flinched, then apologized softly to me. I told her, "Don't apologize, just tell me what you need now." She said she needed a locked door and silence for 1 hour. I barred the door, then checked windows because bad men love gaps. Outside wind rose and it carried a far shout down canyon walls. Eliza's eyes widened and she asked if they'd found us already here. I said not yet, but we'd act like they were close anyway. I showed her the pantry and the traps and the extra blankets. She studied the supplies and her face changed from panic to focus. That focus told me she wasn't fragile, just hunted and tired badly. I lit the stove and the iron popped as heat woke up. Eliza asked how to help and I gave her honest work first. She peeled potatoes and I salted meat and we spoke plain, quietly. I told her the cabin rules because winter punishes mistakes fast here. Never waste bullets, never waste matches, and never waste daylight either, ever. She repeated each rule like a student and that steadied her too. Night came early and the storm finally broke across the ridge line. Snow hammered the roof and the chimney moaned like a tired bull. Eliza sat near the fire listening while I sharpened my knife slowly. She asked why I wasn't afraid and I admitted I was some. Fear kept me careful, I said, and careful kept us alive today. We ate in quiet because words can rattle loose hope sometimes too. After supper, I nailed fresh boards over the lower window frame panes. Eliza held the lamp and her hands finally stopped shaking there much. Then the dog lifted his head and a low growl rolled out. I froze and Eliza's eyes snapped toward the dark porch boards outside. Something scraped the steps soft and slow like boots testing weight carefully. I put one finger to my lips and Eliza understood instantly then. The scrape moved away and the storm swallowed it, but not fully. I checked the back door and found a fresh mark in snow. A boot print deep and wide pointed straight toward my smokehouse shed door. Eliza saw it and whispered they'd found us and I didn't argue. I said we'd wait till morning, then move before the pass closed. The blizzard thickened overnight and the world turned into a white wall outside. At dawn I opened the door and snow tried to enter the cabin. I shut it quick and told Eliza the storm was now our cover. She asked if cover could also be a cage and I said yes sometimes. We moved with purpose because waiting invites fear to start inventing stories. I checked the chimney draft, then checked the rifle, then checked her face. Eliza sat straighter and asked me to teach her the mountain habits today. I said start with fire, then water, then food, then watch the dark. She nodded and began splitting kindling small pieces first, like learning letters slowly. I watched her swing careful and I saw stubborn strength under that shaking. When the stove caught, she smiled once, then swallowed it like a secret. I brewed coffee and she warmed her hands, staring into steam like prayer. Outside wind erased every trail and that helped, yet it frightened me too. A storm can hide a friend and hide an enemy and hide intent. I showed her my store of bullets and she counted them without blinking. She said she wouldn't waste a single one and I believed her then. I taught her how to hold a lantern low so glass won't show far. She practiced at the window, then backed away because shadows can invite shots. We ate cold bread and she insisted on cleaning because order calmed her. I let her because a busy hand keeps a hunted mind from breaking. By mid-morning, the cabin felt like a small fort, not a hiding hole. Eliza asked about the rope memory in my eyes and I didn't answer. Instead, I showed her traps and how to reset them without freezing fingers. She listened close and asked smart questions and didn't pretend she knew. That honesty mattered because pride kills faster than wolves in deep snow. The wind eased briefly, and the dog paced, and his hackles rose again. I stepped onto the porch and I saw nothing, yet I felt, watched. Eliza stood behind me and whispered she hated quiet because quiet meant waiting. I told her quiet can also mean choice, and choice is how we survive. She asked what choice looked like now, and I said vigilance, then movement. We spent the afternoon stacking wood inside and sealing cracks with cloth strips. Eliza worked hard and sweat darkened her hairline and she didn't complain once. When dusk came, the sky cleared and stars appeared sharp as broken glass. Clear nights mean colder nights and colder nights mean men travel harder. I checked the yard and found a new track by the chopped wood. It wasn't from morning because morning had erased everything clean with drifting powder. Eliza stared at the print and her voice went thin and she said, "Rourke." I studied the heel mark and saw it turned inward like a writer's habit. Then I found another print leading toward the pantry wall close to the vent. My stomach tightened because a hungry man heads for food, not for talk. Eliza reached for my sleeve and asked if we should run right now. I said not yet because running blind in mountains is dying with speed. I told her to sit and breathe and keep that paper hidden deep. She obeyed, but her eyes never left the door and neither did mine. The dog whined low and the lantern flickered and the stove popped once. I heard a soft scrape beneath the porch like steel on frozen nail heads. Eliza whispered, "Boone, he's under us," and I nodded without looking away. I lifted the trapdoor latch slow and felt cold air rise from below. A shadow moved under the boards and a hand reached up searching for warmth. That hand came up through the trapdoor gap, feeling for the latch like a blind snake. I held the lantern low, and Eliza held her breath behind me. The dog growled, then went silent, which scared me more than noise. I dropped the lantern on the floorboards and it rolled against the stove leg. With both hands free, I lifted the rifle and aimed at darkness under my feet. A voice whispered my name, not Eliza's, and it wasn't Rourke. It was Tomlin, the store clerk. He said he only wanted food, yet his eyes kept darting toward the window. I yanked him up by the collar and set him on the porch where moonlight showed his shaking mouth. Tomlin wasn't built for crime. His hands were ink-stained, not calloused. He stammered that Deputy Rourke promised silver if he marked my trail and tested my locks. I asked why he crawled under my porch in a blizzard, and he said Rourke wanted me outside. A whistle sounded far below, 3 notes, then 2, and Tomlin flinched like a beaten dog. Eliza whispered, "It's a signal." I told her stay back, but she stepped to the doorway, eyes with dread. The signal pulled me toward the tree line because no man whistles in that weather unless he thinks he's safe. I shoved Tomlin into the snow and warned him to crawl back to town and confess. He nodded fast and disappeared into the white. I turned to Eliza and told her to bolt the door and keep the rifle near the stove. She tried to protest, but I cut her off with one look. Then I stepped into the storm and the wind erased my footprints before I'd taken 10 paces. A faint orange glow flickered near my smoke shed ahead. I moved slow because traps can be made from light and fear. The glow came from a lantern hung on my shed hook, swaying like someone had just run past it. Under the lantern, my wood pile was scattered and fresh boot marks cut straight toward the creek. I crouched, touched the print edge, and felt the snow still loose minutes old. A shout rose from the cabin, muffled by timber, then a sharp cry that froze my blood. It was Eliza, and it held one word, Boone. I spun and sprinted uphill. The night swallowed me and the light vanished. The door stood open, banging softly, and snow sifted across the threshold like ash. Inside, the lantern lay shattered and the dog whined under the table. Eliza's shawl was gone and her scarf hung from a nail torn clean. A boot had kicked the chair aside and my stove poker was missing. I didn't need more proof. Rourke had used the clerk to pull me away. I listened hard and heard nothing but wind, yet I smelled tobacco, fresh and cheap. On the floor, a scrap of paper lay, a false warrant. He wanted me to choose law or her. My hands shook once, then steadied because rage is useless without direction. I searched the room for the seam at her ribs, praying she'd kept the real paper hidden. The dress she'd worn was still on the bed and the inner stitch was cut open empty. She'd taken the proof with her, or they'd taken it from her. Either way, she was still fighting. I knelt by the hearth and found a single button, brass stamped with an eagle, not Carter's. That meant militia supply or stolen uniform. I grabbed my coat and I spoke to the dog finder. We plunged into the drifts, and the dog led with his nose low, circling, then choosing one line like it was a rope. Beyond the cabin, the snow showed drag marks where someone had hauled a body or a bound person toward the creek bank. I swallowed hard and forced my thoughts to stay useful. The tracks turned south toward the old logging road, and that told me they had a wagon hidden. From the dark, I heard Rourke's laugh, faint, carrying over ice, and I heard him say, "She's mine now." I didn't answer, but my feet moved faster. At a clearing, a tarp hit a wagon and 2 horses stamped in the snow. 3 men stood near it, heads bent together, and one held my stove poker like a trophy. Eliza wasn't in sight, and my gut went cold. I slid behind a log and counted breaths because haste can cost a life. Then I heard her voice steady, saying they'd have to kill her to get the paper. Rourke stepped into lantern glow badge shining and called my name. He said, "Trade yourself for her, Boone." I lifted my rifle, not firing, promising, and whispered, "I'm coming." Rourke laughed and told his men to bring her forward slow like they were showing off a calf. Eliza stepped into the lantern light, wrists tied with rope, chin lifted high. Her cheek bruise looked darker, but her eyes were steady. She kept one hand curled, and I knew the paper was inside her fist. Rourke said she'd confessed a fraud and that I was the buyer of letters. He wanted me to nod so the others could feel right. I called back that his warrant named a judge, and the men hesitated. Rourke's smile stayed, but his shoulders tightened. I stepped from behind the log, hands open, rifle laid on the snow where they could see it. Eliza made a shake of her head, warning me, yet she didn't beg. Rourke said I was sensible at last, and he told his men to keep their pistols ready anyway. I said, "Untie her and I'll come in close enough to talk." He refused, and that told me he wasn't here for law, he was here for control. The rope on Eliza's wrist was a knot to cut with a blade. I shifted my boot and slid my knife under snow. Rourke lifted his hand, and one man raised his pistol toward Eliza. My chest tightened, and I forced my voice to stay calm. I said, "You won't shoot because you need her alive to keep that badge shining." Rourke sneered and told Eliza to open her fist. She refused, and his men shifted uneasy. I stepped forward slow, and the dog burst from the trees, barking hard. In that split second, Eliza dropped the folded paper into the snow at my feet. I let my boot cover it, and I kept walking. Rourke's eyes narrowed like he sensed something wrong. Rourke leaned in and said, "The mountains won't save you, Boone." I answered that storms erase tracks and lies erase men, so he'd pray for both. I bent as if to surrender, and my fingers slipped the paper into my sleeve. Eliza met my eyes, and I saw fire behind fear. Rourke motioned, and two men grabbed my arms and searched my coat. I let them because I needed to get close to the wagon. When they turned to bind my wrists, I whispered to Eliza, "When I move, you run." She gave one nod, and the wind rose again. The rope came out, and one man tried to loop it around my wrists. I let my shoulders slump, and I let them believe I was beaten. Rourke stood close, smiling because he loved the moment a man yields. Eliza watched him, then watched me, and her eyes asked one quiet question. "Are you going to survive this without turning into him?" I answered with the only thing I had: a calm breath and a plan. When the rope brushed my skin, I shifted my weight and stamped my heel. The paper in my sleeve stayed hidden, but my knife slid into my palm. The dog lunged again, barking hard, and the horses spooked at the sound. That noise was my mercy, because chaos makes liars lose their script. I snapped my wrist free and cut the rope before it could cinch. I didn't swing wild, I moved small, because small moves keep people breathing. The man holding me cursed and reached for his pistol too late. I hit his hand with the flat of my blade, and the pistol dropped. Rourke shouted, and his voice cracked because control was slipping away fast. Eliza didn't scream. She stepped back and kicked snow into a lantern. The flame guttered, and the clearing went dim and uneven at once. In that half-dark, I felt the world narrow into sound and breath. A second man rushed me, and I shoved him into the wagon, tongue hard. Wood thudded, and he dropped to one knee, swearing through his teeth. Rourke reached for Eliza, using her like a shield without shame. He grabbed her shoulder and dragged her close, badge flashing like holy metal. He told me to stop, and he pressed his pistol against her ribs. Eliza's jaw set, and she stared at him like he was dirt. Then she did something brave and quiet. She stomped his boot with her heel. Rourke hissed, and his pistol wavered 1 inch, and that inch mattered. I stepped forward and placed my hands up like I was surrendering again. I said, "Easy now, you don't want a dead woman on your hands." He sneered and said, "Dead women don't talk, so they're better anyway." That sentence told every man there exactly what kind of law he was. One of the hired men hesitated and glanced at Eliza's bruised cheek. I saw it, and I used it because doubt is the first crack. I said, "You boys heard him, you still want to be his hands." The hesitant man swallowed, and his eyes flicked to the badge, then away. Rourke noticed too, and his face tightened like rawhide in cold air. He shoved Eliza toward the wagon and ordered them to tie her tighter. Eliza twisted, and her bound hands slid behind her back fast. She looked at me once, and I knew she was buying time for me. I moved toward the lantern again, and I kicked it fully into snow. Darkness fell thicker, and the storm wind rose like it was listening. I grabbed Eliza by the elbow and pulled her toward the tree line. Rourke fired into the air, not at us, because he still wanted her alive. His men shouted, and boots crunched behind us, closing the distance fast. The dog ran ahead, then circled back, snapping at ankles and buying seconds. Eliza stumbled once, and I caught her because speed means nothing without balance. We hit the creek bank and ice cracked under snow like thin glass. I didn't take the crossing, I took the willows because willows hide bodies. Eliza breathed hard and the rope on her wrists sawed her skin raw. I cut it quick and she flexed her hands, then nodded thanks once. No speeches, no tears, just movement because survival doesn't wait for comfort. Rourke's men split up and one tried circling wide through the brush. I heard him and I threw a stone into the opposite reeds far. He followed the sound because fear makes men chase shadows like children. Eliza grabbed my sleeve and whispered she couldn't run much longer. I told her you won't have to, not if we get to the rocks. Up ahead, a line of boulders rose, stacked like a broken wall. I guided her behind them and we crouched, breathing steam into our scarves. The storm eased again and moonlight sharpened every shape on the snow. That light was dangerous because it makes hunters feel confident and loud. Rourke called out, pretending to bargain, pretending to be reasonable now. He said, "Clara, come back, we can settle this proper in town." Eliza didn't answer and her silence made him angry enough to slip. He said, "Boone, you can't protect her forever, she'll crack on her own." I whispered to Eliza, "He's trying to make you doubt yourself." She whispered back, "I'm done doubting, that's what got me bruised." Those words warmed something in my chest, then the cold returned fast. Because I saw the truth, this wasn't ending with one escape. Rourke would keep coming and the town would keep nodding along. A false badge is a sickness and it spreads through lazy minds. To cure it, you need daylight proof and someone brave enough to stand. I pulled the folded paper from my sleeve and pressed it into Eliza's hand. I told her, "If I fall, you carry this to a real authority." She stared at me and her eyes turned wet again, but she didn't break. She said, "I won't leave you," and I said, "You will if I tell you." That's what partnership looks like in the mountains, hard choices and honest duty. We waited, and the dog's ears twitched toward a new sound behind us. A single horse moving, careful, not like a hunter, more like a scout. I raised my rifle, then lowered it because the rider didn't rush. A voice called my name, and it wasn't Rourke, and it wasn't town folk. It was Isaiah Two Rivers, a man who knew these ridges like prayer. Isaiah rode into view, slow hands open, showing he didn't want trouble. He wore a plain coat, and his eyes missed nothing, not even Eliza's bruise. He said, "Boone, you stirred up wolves, and they're spilling into my trails too." I told him I didn't ask for it, but I wouldn't run from it. Isaiah glanced down the creek, then back at me, measuring my words. He said, "The town's talking, and Rourke's paying, and men are getting stupid." He said, "Stupid men blame the nearest outsider when their fear needs a face." Eliza stiffened because she understood that warning without any extra explanation. I told Isaiah, "This girl's got proof that badge belongs to a dead marshal." Isaiah's gaze sharpened and he said, "Carter," and his voice went cold. He said, "Carter helped my people once and he didn't vanish by accident." He asked to see the paper and Eliza held it out with steady hands. Isaiah read, slow lips, barely moving, then folded it neat like it mattered. He handed it back and said, "This is a knife, but use it careful." Then he said, "You can't take this into town alone, they'll hang you both." I asked him what he'd do, and he pointed toward the high pass west. He said, "There's a line cabin, old trapping post, you can vanish there." He said, "I'll ride to a man who can read warrants and won't bend." He meant the circuit judge who wintered near Helena, not a barroom talker. Eliza looked at me, hope fighting fear again in her eyes. Rourke's shout cut through the timber and his men's lanterns winked below. Isaiah's horse snorted and he said, "Decision time, Boone, right now." I took Eliza's hand and I felt how cold her fingers were. I said, "You trusted me at the station, now trust me one more night." She nodded and we followed Isaiah into the trees, single file, silent. Behind us, Rourke cursed because he'd lost the trail and fresh drift again. Ahead of us, the mountain opened like a dark doorway and winter waited. Eliza breathed my name once and I answered with a promise I meant. I said, "No more pretending and no more running alone, not ever again." And in the snow behind us, the false badge kept shining, furious and hungry. Isaiah led us uphill and the wind covered our tracks while the lanterns below swung angry through timbered darkness. We reached the line cabin by midnight and its door groaned open like it remembered every man who lied. Eliza stood by the hearth and I set fresh wood down, then I checked her wrists for new bleeding. She said she was fine, but her voice shook and I told her truth counts more than bravado. Isaiah poured water and said Rourke would blame his people next because a false badge needs a convenient enemy. I said we'd drag the lie into daylight, and Isaiah nodded once because daylight is where predators lose teeth. Eliza asked what daylight meant, and I said a witness, a paper trail, and a man who can read. Isaiah said he knew a clerk named Mrs. Klein, and she kept ledgers straight even when men leaned. At first light, Isaiah rode west alone, and I stayed with Eliza because Rourke's hunters still circled close. The storm eased by noon, and I saw smoke far below, which meant the search party had built a comfort camp. Eliza asked if we should run farther, and I said no, because running forever makes you vanish too. She pressed the folded paper to her chest, and I told her that paper isn't hope, it's a blade. We planned like trappers, and we spoke low because cabins carry sound, and sound carries fear back outward. I told her we'd return to town, but not as fugitives, we'd return as the men's bad conscience. She said the town would hate her, and I said it'll hate truth first, then it'll need it. That afternoon I cut a fresh trail south, and I circled wide so I could watch who followed. 2 riders crossed my old tracks, and I marked their horses because a town lie always hires the same men. I found their camp near the creek, and I listened long because gossip is evidence when it repeats exactly. One man bragged about silver and another bragged about rope, and I felt that old memory rise again. Eliza touched my sleeve and whispered, "We'd do this clean," because she refused to be saved by cruelty. I nodded because I didn't want blood, I wanted Rourke stripped down to what he really was. At dusk Isaiah returned, and he carried a sealed note from Mrs. Klein addressed to a real judge. He said Mrs. Klein remembered Marshal Carter, and she remembered his handwriting, and she didn't fear Rourke's coin. Eliza handed Isaiah the folded proof, and he compared seals. Then he said the mismatch was plain. I asked how we'd make town listen, and Isaiah said, "You don't ask, you force a public reading." We chose Sunday morning because people gather then, and cowards hide less when their wives are watching nearby. Eliza swallowed hard and asked if I'd stand beside her, and I said I'd stand in front. Isaiah said standing in front is fine, but we also needed a second knife, a living witness. So we went for Tomlin, the clerk who crawled under my porch, and we found him shaking in his store. Tomlin tried to deny it, but his eyes gave him away, and Eliza said she'd forgive him for truth. He cried then and admitted Rourke paid him, and he admitted Rourke carried Carter's badge in a velvet wrap. Tomlin also admitted one more thing, and it chilled me because he'd seen Carter's ring on Rourke's chain. Isaiah said that ring belonged to Carter's widow, and I knew then Rourke didn't just steal a badge. We wrote Tomlin's statement down, and Mrs. Klein sealed it because ink holds steady when voices tremble. Eliza asked if paper alone could win, and I said paper wins when it's read aloud to faces. That night I cleaned my rifle again, not to use it, but to remind myself that restraint is harder. Eliza sat close to the fire, and she practiced saying her name without flinching, without apologizing, without shrinking. She chose Eliza Marlowe as truth, and she said it slowly like a vow made to her own soul. Before dawn we rode toward Coldwater Pass, and we carried no lantern because we wanted no early warnings. Isaiah rode ahead, and Tomlin rode beside him because a frightened man looks honest when he finally chooses fear. At the town edge we split apart, and I took Eliza down the alley by the church fence. She asked if she should hide her bruise, and I said no, because hiding is how Rourke keeps power. The bell rang and people gathered, and I watched their eyes turn curious, then hungry, then uncertain all at once. Rourke arrived late on purpose, and his badge flashed because he liked entering like thunder, not like truth. Mrs. Klein stepped forward and asked him which judge signed his warrant, and his smile faltered for half a breath. Tomlin raised his hand and confessed, and the crowd murmured because confessions turned certainty into questions very fast. Eliza held up the folded proof, and Isaiah demanded a reading, and Mrs. Klein began with Carter's name. Rourke tried to shout her down, but his words tangled because printed ink doesn't blink when a liar blinks. I watched the crowd change, and I felt the moment hinge because shame is heavy and everyone carries some. Rourke reached for Eliza, and I stepped between them and said, "One lie ends today in front of everyone." Isaiah called for the judge's rider, and when hooves answered outside, Rourke's eyes finally showed fear, not confidence. The church bell rang, and folks packed the yard smelling snow and stew, ready for worship and gossip today too. Rourke rode in late badge flashing bright, and he tipped his hat like a man owning every breath here now. Mrs. Klein stood firm by the steps, ledger in hand, and her calm face made the crowd quiet down. Tomlin hovered beside her, hands shaking hard, and he looked like a rabbit that finally chose daylight today. Eliza stayed near my shoulder, chin lifted, bruise uncovered, and I felt the town's eyes weigh her soul. Rourke pointed at her, voice booming loud, and he said she'd swindled me, then stole papers from Helena. I didn't speak yet because letting a liar talk first lets him build a ladder that breaks later. Isaiah Two Rivers watched the edges, eyes sharp, and he kept my back clear of sudden hands near. Mrs. Klein asked for the warrant, and Rourke waved folded paper high, smiling like scripture always wins today. She asked which judge signed it, and Rourke answered quick, naming a dead man, and a few brows lifted. Tomlin swallowed, then confessed he'd been paid, and his words fell heavy because silver always leaves a stain behind. The crowd murmured, shifting boots in snow, and I heard certainty cracking like river ice under spring weight today. Rourke snapped at Tomlin to shut up, and that flash of temper showed everybody the man beneath polish. Eliza held up her proof hand steady, and she said Carter's name, and the yard went still again. A woman near the fence whispered Marshall Carter, and her husband frowned because he'd traded with Carter last fall. Mrs. Klein opened the paper and read each line slow, letting ink do the fighting nobody wanted. Rourke tried to laugh it off, but his laugh came thin and his eyes kept searching for exits. He claimed it was forged, then claimed it was stolen, and each new claim sounded weaker than the last. Isaiah stepped forward and said Carter saved lives, so Carter's death deserved truth, not a saloon story. The crowd started leaning toward Eliza, not with hunger now, but with the strange pull of conscience rising. Rourke felt it, and he reached toward Eliza, meaning to drag her close, using her body as cover again. I stepped between them, palms open, and I said, "No, not today. You won't touch her here." Rourke's hand hovered near his pistol, and I watched his knuckles whiten because pride hates being denied in public. A young man shouted, "Hang him," and that shout spread fast because towns love simple endings that feel clean. Two older men moved in, rope already in hand, and my stomach turned, remembering boots twisting in air. I raised my voice steady and low, and I said, "If you do that, you become him." The rope men hesitated because nobody likes being told they're the villain, especially with their wives watching close. Rourke sneered at me, calling me traitor, and he said the town needed swift justice, not lectures from hermits. I told him justice isn't speed, it's honesty, and honesty takes daylight, witnesses, and patience to hold. Mrs. Klein lifted her ledger and said she'd logged every seal, every date, and Rourke's badge didn't match. A rancher asked to see the badge up close, and Rourke backed half a step, which screamed louder. Eliza spoke, then, voice trembling but clear, and she said she'd been hit for hearing truth. She didn't describe the worst parts, just showed her bruise and said she ran because the law was fake. That sentence landed hard because men understood fakes. They'd all been cheated by scales, cards, or promises before. Rourke tried to grab the paper, and Isaiah caught his wrist, not rough, just certain and unmoving there. Rourke jerked free, then swung his elbow, and Isaiah didn't flinch because mountain patience can look like stone. The crowd surged forward, and for a moment it looked like a lynch mob would form on instinct alone. I stepped onto the church step, shoulders square, and I said, "You'll hear the full reading, then decide." Mrs. Klein read the statement again, slower, including Tomlin's confession and the names of the men Rourke paid. One name belonged to a local, and that man's face went gray because his own neighbors turned to stare. He tried to deny it, but Tomlin pointed, and the denial died because fear can't outshout ink today. Rourke's smile vanished, and he shouted for his deputies, but none stepped forward because they were hired hands. A rider's hooves clapped outside town, and the sound cut through talk like thunder, reminding everyone who's real. The rider carried a sealed note, and he handed it to Mrs. Klein, who broke it open calmly. She read that a circuit judge wanted Rourke held, and suddenly the badge looked small like a toy. Rourke backed toward the street, and his gaze turned wild because a liar hates facing a door that locks. He drew his pistol halfway, then stopped because 50 eyes watched, and he knew he'd be shot quick. A man near the front spat in the snow and said Carter deserved better, and the crowd nodded as one. The rope men stepped forward again, anger returning, and I felt that old dread claw up my throat. I moved down off the step, planted myself between Rope and Rourke, and I said, "No hanging, not here." They shouted that he'd killed Carter, and maybe he had, but I said, "You'll prove it, then punish it." Eliza touched my sleeve and whispered thank you because she didn't want salvation that turned into another cruelty. Rourke laughed bitter, then pleaded suddenly, promising he'd leave, promising he'd pay, promising anything that bought breath. The judge's rider took his arm, and Rourke cursed, but he went because the crowd had finally stopped believing. As they marched him away, the town stayed silent, and that silence felt heavy like snow settling on graves. Eliza let out one shaky breath, and I said, "You did it. You stood in daylight, no pretending anymore." When Rourke was finally led away, the town didn't cheer right off. It just exhaled like folks realizing they'd almost done something they couldn't undo. Snow drifted across the church steps, and the badge that scared everyone a day ago looked cheap in a deputy's hand. Eliza stood beside me, shoulders still tight, but her eyes were steady now. Mrs. Klein closed her ledger, and she looked at Eliza like a woman looks at another woman who survived. No pity, no gossip smile, just respect earned the hard way. Tomlin wiped his face, and Isaiah Two Rivers gave one small nod like a promise kept. Then the crowd began to break apart, and you could feel the story changing in real time. Eliza turned to me and whispered, "I thought I'd have to keep acting forever." I shook my head and said, "Not in my cabin, not in my life." We walked out of town, slow, not sneaking, not running, just leaving like people with names again. On the ridge, the wind hit us clean, and the mountains opened wide, quiet as mercy. Eliza touched the bruise on her cheek, then lowered her hand like she didn't need to hide it anymore. She said, "Eliza Marlowe, that's who I am." I answered, "Then that's who this land will know." At the cabin, I set fresh paper on the table, and I laid a deed beside it. Half mine, half hers, if she chose it. No flowery vows, just real security. She stared a long moment, then said, "I'll earn it." I said, "You already did by standing in daylight." That night we sat by the stove, listening to the storm move past the pines. No pretending, no performances, just the honest quiet of two people choosing a life. Outside, snow covered our tracks clean. Inside, we started building something that didn't need lies to hold it up.